Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I'm Elizabeth, the events coordinator. Joining me this evening is historian Colin Woodard, and he is here this evening to present his new book, Union, The Struggle to Forge the Story of United States Nationhood. A reminder that our events program is sustained by book sales, so if you would like a copy of the book, if you copy of the book, please do purchase it from Gibson's Bookstore. I'm putting a link to purchase the book in the chat bar. And we did mail book plates to Colin. Colin will be signing those and sending those back. So if you do purchase any of his books from Gibson's Bookstore, we will send you a book plate with that as well. So Colin, tell us about Union.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for hosting this virtual event. I'm sorry we couldn't have this in person in Concord. I was looking forward to that, but such is life in the pandemic. And thank you all for coming who are here online to this virtual event and for supporting your independent bookstore near or not very near to you, depending on where you're arriving from. Union is about, as the subtitle suggests, about the struggle to create the story of what the United States was supposed to be. It's myth, right? The myth of where it came from, what its purpose is, who belongs and who doesn't. And I wanted to write this book because one of my previous books, American Nations, a history of the 11 rival regional cultures of North America, had put forward the argument that there'd never been one America, but rather several Americas, each of them tying back essentially to the distinct colonial projects that formed on the eastern and southern rims of what's now the United States. And that each of those colonial projects were rivals and often enemies. The New England colonies, the Dutch founded area around what's now New York City, the Chesapeake Tidewater Zone, the Appalachian Backcountry, the Spanish Southwest, the deep southern lowlands, and so on, that each of these places was founded by a different group at different times with entirely different ethnographic and religious and social characteristics and original intents and ideas about the relationship between individual liberty and the building of a free society, ultimately between church and state, between ruled and not, and ideas about who participates in a democracy, from a classical republicanism modeled on the slave states of the ancient world to an Enlightenment founded idea that people are somehow free-born, and those ideas were all clashing throughout the colonial period. And then these different regional cultures, each of which colonized a pretty distinct tier of the west out to the Mississippi and somewhat beyond through to the 1830s, that these formed sort of separate nations, if you will, with separate ideologies and ideas and history. And they all fought in this shared struggle against a shared threat of British imperial policy in the 1770s, and lo and behold, they won. And they ended up rather by accident, in something called the United States, and nobody was quite sure what that was. Now, American Nations talked about how understanding these fissures and this settlement history and understand the United States as a federation of entirely distinct and separate cultures and nations, that if you understand the map closely and the history, then our own history, which appears confusing and full of cacophony, actually starts making sense, along with all sorts of things, including past and present, county level voting habits and political behaviors and how one area responds or doesn't to the pandemic, and all of those things all play out today. So that always led to the question in my mind, though, is to, okay, I mean, that's definitely the case. It definitely affects things now. People in the antebellum period and the Civil War period totally recognize this, and we're still fighting over whether or not they thought we were a European Union style confederation of organic independent states, or whether we were a unitary nation and what all that meant. Where and how did we get this idea that we're one nation with one story and one history, that we're one peoples with this shared, myth or fable or origin story with shared ideals and purpose, the thing that holds us together? Because obviously we have one, right? Many of you can probably sit there and articulate some of what it's supposed to be: an American creed, an American exceptionalism. And whatever it was, it succeeded pretty well because the United States, obviously has held together and has done some, remarkable things in the world, despite its, warts and missteps. It's definitely not been an unsuccessful project. So Union was asking the question, okay, when and where and by whom did this story come from? And how did it evolve and how did it take hold, given this massive structural problem that I already knew from American nations not only existed, but persisted as an explicit and well understood fact, for the first, century of our history almost. And the answer is told through Union. I told it through the people who were the central figures in propagating and fighting over the myth, and their struggle over these overlapping individuals over the better part of a century, starting when the myth was first being created in the 1830s, because there was no answer in the 1830s as to what the United States was, and they needed one, and proceeding until one of the rival basic, nationhood stories finally won out on a federation-wide level and had sort of consensus dominance over the whole country interregionally. And that happened in the 1910s and 1920s. So that's the bookends of the book chronologically, but it's told through the people who did it as like a multiple biography, almost like a novel, with the narrative starting with who they are and where they came from and what their experiences were, because these are really important ideas. I think a lot of people understand that ideas have enormous power in the world, as weapons or forces for good or destruction, but they don't come from nowhere, right? They emerge out of people and their experiences. So I wanted to tell the story of how that happened and how an idea can catch hold and build in our own heads as individuals the idea that we belong to a nation. How is it done and propagated? What were the struggles over it? How does it win out over its rivals? So it was trying to do several things at once. And the answer, which surprised me, I thought that the story when I first started researching it would essentially be starting after the Civil War. My assumption had been that and obviously we fought a civil war and people didn't agree on what the United States was, that sometime after the Civil War, after hundreds of thousands had died and there had been this cataclysmic conflict, that there must have been this effort to reconcile the North and the South on some sort of terms and to build a story that would glue the country back together and conceal, pave over, and hopefully heal and remove the divisions that had just set it apart, and that must be where the story lay. But I learned that no, in fact, the story started, like I said, in the 1830s, in the aftermath of the War of 1812, the Napoleonic Wars, and the passing from the scene of the generation who'd fought the American Revolution. As they started dying and disappearing, the living memory of the shared struggle for independence was lost. And that had been the sort of stopgap measure. What holds the United States together is we beat the British, right? That was great, right? George Washington was cool. We did it. Hooray. We still did it. Hooray, right? But that no longer worked once no one remembered that anymore. And after the War of 1812, the threat that the British were somehow going to take us out again had kind of been removed. And suddenly it was like, well, what now? What holds us together? And the story follows the first person who did it, George Bancroft, who articulated the first vision, which was you'll recognize a lot of. It's the civic national vision. He was a New Englander. He grew up in Worcester. He was descended from early Puritans. His father was one of the leading congregational ministers in New England, and he attended Phillips Exeter and then Harvard, and was an excellent graduate. And when he graduated at age 17 in 1817, President Kirkland sent him, along with several other, Edward Everett and several other leading graduates, to earn this rare thing that nobody had yet in the United States, a doctorate, a PhD, that they would form the cadre to transform Harvard from this, congregational boarding school, trying to keep track of your young kids so they don't go astray and maybe they'll become congregational ministers if you're lucky. No, he wanted to make it into a real research university, a modern university in the sense that only existed at the time really in Germany, where they were building these incredible research universities using new scientific methods. And so Kirkland sent these people out to do that.
Can you
And
give the name again on the that first one that was sent out to get his doctorate?
George Bancroft is the main character. Yeah. Yeah, so Bancroft goes to Germany, and he literally studies under Hegel and Hering, and he meets the Van Humboldts, and he takes a tour around Europe where he's hanging out with Lafayette and Lord Byron and Goethe and Washington Irving, and comes back to the United States and ultimately writes the first packaged draft of our national story, where he merged his New England upbringing, this idea of the Puritans as a covenanted people chosen by God to do things, errand in the wilderness, light on the hill. We're going to build a more godly and perfect society, and we're tasked to do it, with the German ideas that each nation was an organism growing from a seed and had inevitable qualities and would grow from that original information and evolve, and that he believed that the United States was growing from its instructions, its God-given instructions, to carry the mantle of freedom, the baton of freedom forward for humanity across the continents, and the ideals in the Declaration of Independence would be its founding creed. The fundamental and inherent equality of humans and their unalienable rights to liberty and the pursuit of happiness and consented self-government. And that was it. And that America had to succeed because Providence had chosen it, and so on and so forth. In fact, God was involved, in the founders, hanging over their shoulders while they wrote the Constitution. All of that stuff about American exceptionalism, about us having some chosen mission in the world that you'll all recognize, was all first packaged together from different ingredients by Bancroft in his History of the United States in 10 volumes, which was really a prehistory of the United States, because those 10 volumes only got him through like 1790 or something like that, and took him his entire life to write. He didn't finish his revisions and his volumes and his annexes until he was in his 80s. The first volume, though, came out in the 1830s, and each of these volumes was a stunning cultural moment, a bestseller. Everybody had to read it. Everyone was debating it. It framed the way people thought about the country's history, about the way politicians talked about it. And Bancroft wasn't just a bystander. He got involved in politics. Massachusetts was, of course, Federalist and stronghold. He was from the rival party, the Jeffersonian Democrats, and ultimately Andrew Jackson's. He actually ran for governor and was the Democratic nominee, then ran the Democratic Party machine in Massachusetts. And then when President Polk was elected, became his Secretary of War and his Secretary of the Navy, later served as our ambassador to the United Kingdom and to Berlin, and played a part in applying his principles in issuing the orders that led to the annexation of Texas, issuing as Navy Secretary the orders that led us to annex California, setting up the US Naval Academy. He was a huge and towering figure. But his civic myth did not go unchallenged. And there was a rival myth that emerged very quickly from one of his contemporaries, William Gilmore Simms of South Carolina, who argued quite the opposite. He argued that explicitly that Jefferson had been wrong in writing the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. The humans were clearly not equal and didn't have these inalienable rights, or if they did, they only belonged to those races, which merged ethnography and race at the time, who were capable of using it and doing it. And that what made the United States special and what defined it is it was a collection of the organic nations, South Carolina and Massachusetts and so on, that all shared in being the homelands of the allegedly superior Anglo-Saxon race, and that we were an ethno-state, and that it was the Anglo-Saxons that carried all of the genius that made the United States important, and that all other races and peoples were destined, because they were inadequate, to tutelage, servitude, or slavery underneath the Anglo-Saxon race, and that was the model. And the book, not to spoil everything in the book, but the book is about the struggle between that civic national vision and the ethnic national vision. And the scary part is that they both go back equally far into our history. And as I said, I carried the story through to when one wins provisionally, and it's the ethno-nationalists who win, right? They say that the South, lost the war but won the peace, and it's the crowning moment of them winning the peace is when Woodrow Wilson, the first deep Southern president elected to the office since the Civil War, comes in with a largely Dixie-dominated cabinet, promptly segregates the Union government, the federal government that had won the war, promotes the first Hollywood blockbuster film, The Birth of a Nation, which was in terrible trouble when it was released in 1915, a film whose whole subject was the glorification of the Ku Klux Klan and their reign of terror against African Americans to drive them out of the political sphere in the aftermath of Reconstruction. And a film that generated massive protests and some of the first African American-led protests in the country, and formed some of the blueprints and the model for the future civil rights movement, fighting against the release of this film because it was so controversial. Released at a time when the First Amendment, or the courts had not yet ruled that artistic productions are free speech protected under the Constitution. So states and cities regularly banned things, plays, and now these new things called motion pictures, from, if they were considered to be incompatible with public morals. And so there was all this pressure for major cities to ban this film, which cost $1 gazillion to create. No one had ever seen anything like it. It was Lord of the Rings scale epic, production costs and extras and everything else. And it would have bankrupted Griffiths and Thomas Dixon Jr., the co-producers. But Thomas Dixon Jr. was a close friend of Woodrow Wilson and a graduate school buddy. And they went to Wilson, and Wilson saved the day by screening it in the White House for his cabinet. And then the next day, the film was screened by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for the Supreme Court justices and the leaders of Congress, because the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court had been the Ku Klux Klan and absolutely loved the film and what it had to say. The film contained placards, it's a silent film, quoting at key points, like footnotes to prove their point, from Woodrow Wilson's History of the United States, which took very much the same view as the film. Woodrow Wilson was an outrageous white supremacist, the son of a leading preacher in the Confederate Church of the Presbyterian Church, a preacher who had become famous for his pamphlet, Slavery Ordained by God. He loved his dad, and he carried forth his dad's values all through his life, to a degree that if you read the Woodrow Wilson papers, which are printed and take up an entire wall of a research library, like 78 volumes. This one guy collected them all. You just read those and it's pretty shocking. Woodrow Wilson is even worse than you've recently heard. And it just boggles the mind that generations of biographers have covered up for him because it's so glaring and perpetual throughout his entire life. Two other key characters in the book, the pivotal moment and the pivotal character is Frederick Douglass, because Douglass, who's a little bit younger than Sims and Bancroft, was a escaped slave, as you probably know, and he escaped in a daring escape in disguised as a sailor on the new technology of the day, the equivalent of taking a SpaceX capsule to orbit. He was on one of the first railway trains that existed in the United States from Baltimore, where he was escaping from, to get forward to New York. And then the Underground Railway got him to New Bedford, where he's working as a day laborer, when the abolitionists under William Lloyd Garrison happened to discover him. Not only that this man had this incredible firsthand story of what slavery was like and what it did to the enslaved and the slave lords themselves, but that he was an incredibly gifted speaker, and it turned out writer. And they took him and put him on the lecture circuit, and he became a megastar. He broke with the Garrisonians because they were less committed to the stridency of his cause than he was. I mean, he became militant enough to be supporting John Brown before his raid on Harper's Ferry, but he became an international celebrity, and he used that celebrity to take that civic national vision that Bancroft had articulated, that Bancroft had said, it's all preordained. We just have to sit back and allow history to unroll. He was sort of this priggish, uptight fellow. He wasn't particularly enlightened in his own behavior. He never acknowledged Frederick Douglass's existence, even though they overlap by 40 years. But he also was complacent, and nothing would shake him from the idea that America was just destined to achieve its ideals. Not the Civil War, not the collapse of Reconstruction, nothing. And Bancroft lived to like 1892. I mean, he lived through the whole century. So he saw all this happen. But Douglass was like, no, the United States, these are incredible ideals, and you have completely failed to meet them. And the hypocrisy and the shortcomings and the lack of achievement is something that this country must stand up for. And he was imploring basically white Americans to stand up for the ideals in their own constitution and to realize them. And he did that for his entire life. He lived through the Civil War period. He lived through Reconstruction, and he pressured Abraham Lincoln, who he met twice during the war, towards what became the Gettysburg Address and a declaration that the Civil War was about protecting these civic national ideals. So he's a towering figure whose expression of America and all of its warts and hypocrisy and what its ideals should be are some of the most eloquent descriptions you'll find anywhere of America's civic national tradition. And the other character is Frederick Jackson Turner, briefly the frontier thesis fellow who brought in all that stuff about, that's in our heads about the West and how the frontier somehow made Americans who they are. He was a close friend of Woodrow Wilson's. They went to graduate school together too, were boarding school buddies, interacted and helped each other in their work. But unlike Wilson, Frederick Jackson Turner, who was from Wisconsin, was basically steeped in the civic national tradition, but updated it for the times. Unlike the early 19th century, he swapped out God and providence for the latest scientific theories, the great rage of Darwin's evolutionary theories, and the basic idea that humans would, and human societies would, when encountering a new environment, would adapt to that environment, and that the physical and climatological and geographical characteristics of the Trans-Appalachian West reshaped the settlers who arrived, divorcing them from all the detritus and curse of feudal European history on the East Coast, and allowing them in this sort of imagined Garden of Eden to become good Republicans filled with, self-government and, can-do spirit and all that stuff. And so this is the story of all of that and the ingredients for perhaps revitalizing and reconsidering our sort of now lost national story. The ethno-nationalists won in the 1920s, but they lost in mid-century in the 1960s. I'm a Gen Xer and grew up with the assumption, at least growing up in Maine, that the civic national tradition was the one, that there was this crazy white supremacist tradition that got vanquished in the Civil War and then finished off in the 1960s, and we were all gradually heading towards achieving our ideals. Hey, look, Barack Obama was elected president, problem solved, right? But obviously none of that was, ethno-nationalism, might have been on its heels, but was not vanquished. And we're seeing the struggle between those two traditions playing out today, even on the streets themselves, with echoes of, Wilson and the Birth of a Nation protests, but the stakes perhaps being even higher. So with that, I think I will stop and open it up for questions. More interested in what you all want to hear about than guessing.
So at this point, I will remind people that we do have Colin's books for sale at the bookstore, and we do have signed book plates in the mails. They are that we have ready to send out with any of your purchases. So if you guys want to click around and find the chat box or the Q&A, if you have any questions about this topic, please do ask them. Judith asks, how did Woodrow Wilson's views influence our involvement in World War I?
In World War I, well, the ethno-national views didn't directly apply to his decision to go to war or not to go to war. Wilson was an Anglophile through and through, which not all Americans were. As a young man, he was a very strange young man, but among the things he did was even into his teens, he would spend a lot of his time in his writing study drafting the constitutions to a grand Anglophilic republic with him as the Lord Chancellor leader and surrounded by knights and other people with grand titles that he dispensed. He wrote his first academic books about how the United States democracy was deficient because it should really adopt the parliamentary model of Britain, and he wrote a whole thesis on how this should happen. And so he was very Anglophilic, so it's not surprising that once president, he would choose to be intervening against the Germans, not with them. But where his racial views and his white supremacist views played out was at the Peace of Versailles, the Paris Peace Conference. His street cred as an idealist, which is what I assumed when I was studying international relations in my 20s, and oh yeah, Woodrow Wilson, he was the idealist who thought we'd have a League of Nations and we'd be able to work out rationally through shared discussion our differences, and there would be World War I would be the war to end all wars, and that would be that, right? If only Congress had agreed with him. But if you look at it a little closer, what happened there was a tiered structure for the world where self-determination was a key value that Wilson wanted to have for Europeans in the collapsed Habsburg Empire. That the good white folk of Serbia and Slovakia and Slovenia and Bosnia Herzegovina and everywhere else should have their self-determination. Hey, the map turned out to be messy. I mean, I lived in Eastern Europe for the better part of the 1990s, and it got very messy, and Wilson and his folks made some mistakes. But his fundamental assumption was that idealism, that people should govern themselves, except not outside of Europe, right? The peace conference also had in its mandate to figure out what to do with all of the German and Austrian and Axis power colonial possessions in the Middle East and Micronesia, in Asia and in Africa. And the answer was a tiered structure, not self-determination for those people, right? There was a tiered structure of mandates, class 1, class 2, class 3, based on the perceived racial capabilities of the people in each of those places to govern themselves. And some in the Middle East would have a certain level of tutelage from an imperial power, working their way down to the Micronesians, who were considered, too childlike to govern themselves anytime soon, and would be just under a mandate. Ultimately, the United States would end up with a mandate, but first it was the Japanese who were granted the mandate, which is why we ended up in World War II fighting our way across those tiny islands in the Pacific against the Japanese, as the Japanese had gotten them from the Germans then. So there was that sort of, racially tiered structure of the peace conference. But also at the peace conference, there was an attempt by Japan, one of the victorious powers in the war and one of the allies, to put forward within the League of Nations charter structures, condemning racism. And Woodrow Wilson intervened personally to ensure that that was defeated. I mean, the threat that the ideals that were being pushed by the Japanese and others to the Southern apartheid system was so profound that Wilson could not allow that to proceed. He also refused to speak to the African-American delegation who came to see him. And he also refused to speak to a young man who'd smuggled himself on into the country on a freighter, who would later be known as Ho Chi Minh, a young idealistic Vietnamese man wanting to talk about his country being liberated from imperial control as well. So, all of those things played a big part in the world that Woodrow Wilson created, which was idealistic, but only for the, white people and not necessarily for anybody else, which is consistent with what he was doing back in the United States. And is yet another one of those things that strangely generations of biographers have somehow made fuzzy for us, because it's not a secret. If you look at the documents, it's all there.
Well, that ties neatly into this next audience question. Beth wants to know, how do you work the 19th century migrations to the US into your book?
Into American nations or into the into Union? Yeah.
Either, both. How do the 19th century migrations, I suppose, play a part in Union? Beth clarifies Union. How did the 19th century migrations affect the story of the American myth? I've mangled that a bit, but how did the migrations affect this?
So the migrations, were an enormous event. In the 1830s, the country still didn't really have extensive immigration separate from the East Anglians into New England and the Scots-Irish into the back country and so on and so forth. Migration from other places in significant numbers started coming from the 1830s forward, after Volume 1 was written of Bancroft's history. And the basic migration did not theoretically pose any challenge to the civic national tradition. In fact, the civic national tradition was wonderfully poised to embrace that part of our identity, right? Implicit in it, even if Jefferson and Bancroft themselves didn't practice what they'd written, but implicit in it is, if humans everywhere have inborn unalienable rights, that we're all born equal, that means that the promise of being an American is a universal promise, right? That anybody could become an American if they hold those ideals. And the immigrants coming in the 19th century theoretically would as well. In practice, of course, they'd all freaked out everybody, right? Oh my gosh, there's these people who speak a strange language. There's no way they could possibly assimilate because they're not English speaking, because they're not Protestant, because they're in league with the Pope, because they're, Chinese. And oh my gosh, how could Chinese ever understand the brilliance of Jefferson? All of that stuff. Every single wave from, the Irish and everybody else encountered these same attitudes. And lots of people, of course, tried to draw a circle around who was fit to be Americans and who wasn't. But if you believe in the civic national tradition, you're constantly running into the dissonance between those things. And Frederick Douglass, spoke out explicitly in many of his speeches about how the promise, in the Declaration was for everybody, for Chinese people and for Mexicans who are moving into the Southwest and anybody, right? He made that very clear. The ethno-national tradition, by contrast, fits hand in glove with a xenophobic nativism, if you wish, that says these people aren't whatever the chosen harmful people are, the master people of the country. The Anglo-Saxon race was the initial form, and then it kept becoming more elastic to expand to include other Protestants, other white people, but in phases at different times. Different groups were excluded because they, like other inferior peoples from the perspective of this paradigm, were not capable of assimilating. They're not capable of becoming Americans, right? You hear that time and again through our whole history since immigration started, and it ties very nicely with the ethno-national point of view. So you fast forward to somebody like Woodrow Wilson and his History of the United States, his greatest and most popular work, explicitly talked about how the good Anglo-Saxon stock of the country was now threatened by all of these awful Hungarians and Italians and all these immigrants from Southern Europe and other places that didn't have the delightful traditions and heritage of a freeborn and democratic people, right? That was in his book, and it caused him trouble when he started running for office. And Hungarians who were planning to vote for him for president were like, hey, whoa, look at page 737 of your history. What's up with that, right? And he was backtracking, walking it back, as they say today. It's not quite what I meant, even though it says that. So that was all already there at the time. And then when he gets into office, of course, he's segregating the federal government and excluding people based on race, and also, building the environment for the 1924 Immigration Act, which comes after he's in office, but he's laid all the groundwork for it, right? And the 1924 Immigration Act was, immigration had basically been more or less open until 1924. People could come, and if you came here, then you could become Americans. In 1924, they were like, enough is enough. There's all these strange people speaking French and Czech, and some people don't seem to be Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and I'm very upset about this. And we need to protect the Anglo-Saxon Protestant heritage because that's what the country's about. And so they wrote into this act racial quotas to try to maintain the Anglo-Saxon proportionality and dominance of the United States. That's exactly what it said and what its purpose was. So fast forward to 1965, and they decided, in the 60s, that when the civic national tradition was dominant again, that this was not a good thing. And there was an effort under LBJ to rewrite this act, and they did, to remove the race-based quotas. And there's a great book by Tom Gelton that I reviewed for the Washington Post a few years back called Nation of Nations, that tells some of this story of what happened in the 65 Immigration Act, but essentially that act, the sort of Southern segregationist, ethno-nationalist types wanted to put a poison pill in to ensure that Anglo-Saxons remain. So they created that language where if you come, you can get favored immigration status for your extended family, not just your children and your wife or your husband, but also for your uncle and your cousins and everybody else. That chain migration you hear about. That was a conservative poison pill by conservatives who didn't understand math well, who thought that because most immigrants at the time were from the desired countries, because the 1924 Immigration Act made it so, that if you attach that meant that in future, if you English and British people who would come had got to bring all your cousins, everyone else, you would keep the Anglo-Saxon supremacy. They didn't figure out the exponential math that if one, Martian comes that you don't like, and they can bring their uncle and everybody else, that you fast forward a few years, and you can have a significant change from a very small starting point. And that's exactly what happened. So the ethno-nationalists shot themselves in the foot with that one. But you can see how, just in that one thing, an immigration policy, how those two traditions can have two very different ideas about what the immigration regime in a country should look like. And Woodrow Wilson's vision is definitely very much grafted into the 1924 Act.
That was a great answer. That was
probably too long, but there was.
I was riveted by that, actually. That was very interesting. So Janine has a question for us. What is your favorite part of our history, and what events would you like to have seen in person? Now, you have the benefit as a time traveler, theoretical time traveler, Colin, of being a white male. So
I don't, it would make it easier in some places and times, for sure.
So is there any events you would have liked to have seen in person?
Oh gosh, there'd be lots. If we're confining ourselves to the United States, gosh, so many, but it would be very interesting. I mean, oddly enough, I would be really interested in seeing the world pretty much at the moment of contact. It would be interesting. We're here in New England. I live over here in Maine. To show up in 1605 to 1610, when the first reconnaissance missions and are happening from the English and the Dutch and others here, and to be able to travel around and interact with both the early explorer colonizer types and the various Native American and First Peoples tribes who are here, especially if you'd have some kind of universal translator so you could actually talk with people, and to see what that world was really like and what the environment was like, and the forests and the trees and the climate and what they thought of each other. It would have been really, really fascinating. I think would be very illuminating as well. All that stuff prior to the great, the pathogens that were brought by the European explorers, caused a literal decimation of New England's native inhabitants, a fall of 90% of the population, as smallpox and bubonic plague and everything else that they had no resistance to were passed around. But prior to that moment, there was another world that you can only see in glimpses from the explorers' accounts what it was like, and it would be really amazing to really see what it was like.
So do you also have a favorite part of our history that is perhaps more documented? What is your favorite era of history to research?
Well, there's a lot of interesting ones in between, Lobster Coast, the Republic of Pirates, American Character, American Nations. In this book, I've covered like the whole swath of it to some degree or another. So some of it I feel like I've researched more, so perhaps my appetite is more satiated than it would be for things I know less about. But I think some of the, I find some of those things when things are just beginning and we don't have good records to be the most intriguing ones because you can't see them. But if I was to go back to events like in Union, I think it would be fascinating to, what was it like to actually see Frederick Douglass, on a roll giving one of his speeches to a packed hall? Some of his famous ones, because we don't have any radio, we don't have any TV of it. You can read it. You read accounts of just how bowled over people were with his intensity and stuff. I think that would be pretty incredible. And perhaps one of them to go see would be at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. The White City. Those of you who've read Eric Larson's Devil in the White City, it's that World's Fair. Most of many of my characters were all there at the World's Fair, which was sort of an assertion of America's newfound industrial might and nationhood. And Frederick Douglass was there as the only, basically person of African descent invited into the proceedings at any level. And it was because he was the officially appointed minister of another country, of Haiti, who had their own pavilion at the fair, and Douglass had served as the U.S. ambassador to Haiti. So he was there at a time when they were holding, African American People's Day at the fair, and they were literally going out and putting out watermelon stands. And there was a booth where a pancake company had Aunt Jemima, the person we're just talking about now. She was that was debuted, her character, at the World's Fair. She had a little, booth where she was making pancakes and telling, charming stories about the Old South, and that kind of gone with the wind. all of that stuff was happening at the World's Fair. You know, products were being introduced. People were seeing electrical outdoor lighting for the first time. You know, it was a stunning event, and to go there and see that, and at the same time be able to see Douglass in the middle of all this with, you know, Ida B. Wells, the anti-lynching activist, on stage, you know, being taunted by a bunch of, white hecklers, and then he just totally shuts them down. To actually see all that in that scene, and the Haiti Pavilion, and the presidents, and the grand architecture, I think that would be a pretty amazing place and time to have visited.
So I have a question for you. If anybody else has questions that they would like to type into the chat, now is the time to do so. But I have a question for you. When we touched base before this event, you mentioned that you did some of the research for this book at the New Hampshire Historical Society. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about the local connection.
Sure, yeah. It was fun I was over in Concord while researching the book, that big granite mausoleum of the New Hampshire Historical Society. It's a pretty amazing building. Yeah, Maine has nothing like that for our historical society. So well done, all of you. And I went there because the papers of a guy who actually was from Maine, this guy Lorenzo Sabine, who I knew from writing my history of Maine, the Lobster Coast. I knew all about him as the 19th century, it's historian of Eastport, and the last town on the Canadian border. But it turns out, as I was doing my research for Union, that a book he wrote about the Loyalists that was reappraising the Loyalists not as being these bad, horrible people, but as people who'd made a choice of loyalty, to being British subjects and king and country, and seeing them not, in a more nuanced way. And he did that because in Eastport had been occupied in the War of 1812 by the British and not given back until like 1816. And people just crossed the border all the time between British, what became New Brunswick and Maine, and there were loyalists everywhere, right? The southwestern part of New Brunswick, the other side of the bay, were all loyalists. So Sabine knew all these people, was able to interview them and write this book. But within the book, he made the point with data tables that the southern states, southern colonies, provided far less members of the Continental Army, far fewer volunteers per capita than anyone in the North, even if you adjusted for just white per capita. I mean, it was like 1/10 or 1/20 of what New Englanders put forward. And he put this in his book. It wasn't the main part of it, but this led to a massive denunciation by William Gilmore Simms, one of my characters, in a scathing series of reviews about the South's honor being destroyed, and all the reasons why, and what a horrible person this New Englander was, and New Englanders in general, and their tyranny over our history. And I bring this all up because those arguments between Sabine's book and Simms's review are literally the ammunition that was being quoted on the US Senate floor in the debates that end with Senator Sumner of Massachusetts being beaten nearly to a death with a cane by Representative Brooks of South Carolina. What they were fighting over in the days leading up to the beating was Lorenzo Sabine's review and Simms's counter response. And in the New Hampshire Historical Society, in that great granite building, are Lorenzo Sabine's papers, including all the originals of the letters that Simms sent him afterwards, when they sort of, in a friendly way, carried on a rapport afterwards. And Simms says in the letters, things like, Sumner rightly owes his beating to you, and stuff like that. So in writing the book, I was able to come to Concord to find that piece of history, and the way that in the 1850s, a book review could, lead to a senator being beaten, and in a certain way leading us right towards the Civil War. And book reviews were fighting words that could end up in a real conflict, and did. And that episode illustrates it really well. Because Lorenzo Sabine was no firebrand, right? He was a, sort of newspaper editor type up in the provincial town, but such were the times.
So I guess to take us out of the event, Janine would like to know, what is your next project?
Oh gosh, I got to figure that out, don't I? It usually takes me, after I finally finish a book and it gets published, it usually takes me about a year of lying fallow to figure out what the next thing is that I should be doing. And I think especially now, I finished the manuscript nearly a year ago, because that's how long it takes for books to get into print. But to try to decide where readers a couple, 3 years down the road will be from when you first get an idea to when the book actually is in stores, given how rapidly events are moving in these days, we're having, 2 decades of history, every week right now. And things are moving so fast, I can't quite see exactly where you would land yet. So I think it's going to be a little while of watching to sort of see where we're headed and what the questions are that I'd like to tackle. That, a lot of my work is about how the past informs the present, and the present is in such flux that what are the salient questions I think people in general and I personally are most interested in tackling that the past can show us aren't clear to me because things are moving so fast. If 3 years from now Trump is in his second term, we'll be living in a very different world than if 3 or 4 years from now, Joe Biden's in office, or, he's died and his vice president is, or whatever it is. Those are two Earth 1 and Earth 2 scenarios that are so different. I'd really like to wait till after November to even guess what world I'm trying to explain through the past.
So if publishing nuances and commercial considerations were not a factor, is there an aspect of history that you've always wanted to be able to throw yourself into writing about?
Well, yes, and there's a story. In my day job, I work in, newspaper journalism and investigative journalism, and at the Portland Press Herald and Maine Sunday Telegram, I'm fortunate in that I can work sometimes on really big and extensive projects. And the most extensive one I've ever worked on was a few years ago. I spent the better part of a year putting together what ended up being a 29-part series that ran every day on page one of our paper for 29 consecutive days. And it was a continuous narrative of over 50 years, starting on the 50th anniversary of the opening event, of essentially the relationship in recent history between Maine and the Passamaquoddy tribe in Maine, which is our easternmost tribe. And it was a genuinely shocking story. I got into it as a present event having to do with corruption within the tribe, and discovered the reason that corruption was so outlandish was that they had no functional constitution, and that the US Constitution didn't really apply to internal tribal matters. And then I was like, why is that? And then as I dug back to find out why that was, I entered this shocking zone of, Mississippi burning in Eastport, Maine. This is Eastport again. This is on the eastern fringe of the United States, where Maine and New Brunswick come together. And a tribe of people who a generation ago, many people didn't really speak English. Their native language not only had been preserved, it was often the L1 for everybody. The level of discrimination they were experiencing in the 1960s is words of the state. Deprived of their land, everything had been stolen. People could murder a Passamaquoddy person and nobody would bother investigating it. They couldn't get your hair cut in the local barber shops. I mean, it went on and on. It was exactly like, what the Deep South was like at the time, except here in Maine, and Mainers don't know, Passamaquoddy know this, but Mainers didn't know this history, and it was affecting the now because we had this massive land claims suit against the state of Maine in the late 1970s by the Passamaquoddy for 2/3 of the state, because basically Maine hadn't kept its treaty obligations and they'd stolen a trust fund, and they got this young attorney from New York in his 20s who'd shown up, Jewish attorney, all idealistic, who'd shown up in Eastport to start his own practice, and the Passamaquoddies came and said, no one will represent us. And he said, well, I'll represent you. And he was idealistic, and he was smoking pot, and he was having all his friends from San Francisco and New York over, and he was shocking the Gothic local Yankees of Eastport, but he was also representing the Passamaquoddy successfully in police brutality cases and civil rights cases, and getting there so that they could vote. They couldn't even vote in elections. And then he filed this land claims case that shocked the state, where 2/3 of the state was, in theory, could have been awarded to the Passamaquoddy. And there was a negotiated settlement, and the settlement created a regime very different for Maine's tribes than any other federally recognized tribe in the country, with all kinds of oddities in it. And the legacy of the Passamaquoddy experience is very much, the debate is still alive, and the public policy issues we're fighting over today. And this was the backstory to it all. It was a completely different take on Maine and where we were at and the rule of law and the complicity of prosecutors and murders and all kinds of crazy stuff that shocked a lot of people because Maine's a small state. And a lot of the bad guys in the story, you know, went back and found documents to interview people, were, you know, the fathers and grandfathers of sitting justices in our courts and, you know, famous poobahs of one kind or another. To tell that story through essentially the attorney, because the 1960s, he's such a 60s character, and the clash in the country at the time, and he gets run out of the country. There's a state-sponsored conspiracy organized by the attorney general, the state prosecutors, and the Maine State Police, and maybe including the judges, to get rid of him by planting a single marijuana cigarette in his jacket upstairs. And they throw the book at him. I'm going to send him to prison for years. And he says, after he exhausts his appeals, well, I'm going to emigrate to Israel. And they said, okay. And they never chase him. And he goes off to Israel, fights in the war there, returns to the United States, is admitted to practice in Israel by the Justice Ministry after disclosing all this because the case is so outrageous. It goes on, but it's a story, an epic story to tell that one, that if commercial considerations weren't there and I had the time, you know, it's just kind of cinematic and a bit boggling. The story of Don Geller's, Gellers.
That's amazing. Is it available?
The series is called Unsettled, which was published by the Press Herald in 2014, and they combined it into an ebook, which you can indeed get. Unfortunately, probably not from Gibson's, but all those ebook outlets, you know, iTunes and, you know, BNN and Amazon, the Press Herald site itself, you can purchase. You know, it's like $2.99 or $3.99 or something like that, but it exists. It's about 25,000 words, so it's like novella length, but they have it all bound together, so you can read the basics of the story.
That sounds really interesting. I think that's about it for us this evening. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Colin. Thank you very much for joining us from home. Our viewers, please, if you know somebody who would have enjoyed this program tonight, we are recording and we will be putting it up on our social media and on our YouTube page later this week. So please do keep an eye out for that link and do spread it around so that people can become aware of Colin's book. We do have book plates coming in the mail that we can include with any purchases of Colin's books from Gibson's Bookstore. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this evening. Thank you, Colin, for signing in to talk to us. Another fascinating talk, Colin. Thanks, from Judith. And Janine also says thank you. That's it, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks so much.